everyone, to Tom's defense. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what today is going to look like, and then we'll be able to get started. So Tom's going to start by giving his presentation, where he'll take roughly 25 minutes to do that. And then we're going to open it up to his committee for questions. So we're going to go in the order of Shannon, you're going to go first, Dr. Merkich, and then Dr. Krosny will go second. And then we're going to open up the floor for questions from everyone who's here. I will not be asking any questions during this time. I've asked all of my questions over the last 18 months, and no one wants to hear any more questions from me. So we hope that this is an exciting presentation. I know I have spent a lot of time thinking about my own teaching as a result of the results of this study, and I hope that you can reflect a little on your teaching as well. All right, the floor is yours.
All right. Well, welcome everybody. And before I get started, I just want to say thank you to all of the individuals who played a role in getting to this point today. No matter the size of the contribution, whether it was the many hours and emails with my committee members, the encouragement and advice of my cohort mates, family support, or just the encouraging words from many of you here today, it has all been appreciated. So let's get started. Here is my script for today's presentation. I'm going to spend a few minutes addressing the justification for the study, where it sits in the current literature, and my methods before spending the rest of our time together on the fun stuff, the results, and the discussion. So online learning in higher education in the United States has been on a steady growth trend up. And alongside that growth trajectory has been a rise in the use of video in online learning courses. The COVID-19 pandemic created conditions that led to the acceleration of both of those trends, and it raised questions for me about instructors' use of research-supported video design principles. As I started to explore those ideas, I encountered the cognitive theory of multimedia learning, which from here on out I will refer to as CTML. CTML states that the use of words and pictures together is a more effective way of learning than words alone or pictures alone. The theory identifies 3 types of cognitive load, and then inside each of those cognitive loads is a set of what I will call CTML design principles that, when applied, improve student learning outcomes. Those 11 CTML design principles have been mostly studied via quantitative methods and primarily laboratory settings. You couple that with a lack of quality research on what actually occurs in higher education spaces, and the rationale for this study begins to emerge. The study of digital instructional video is still in its infancy, and when research on digital video has been done, it's focused on students and not on instructors. There's definitely a need for more research on how faculty learn to implement technologies into their instruction. Thus, the purpose of this study, and I'll let you read that. The case study combined self-reported survey data from an institution's online instructors, interview data from 5 instructors who had the highest self-reported CTML design principle implementation, and data from 5 video artifacts. From that purpose, here is my research question, and then the 4 sub-questions. So again, I'll give you a moment to read those. In a nutshell, how well are instructors who create video applying the 11 design principles? To frame this work, I applied 2 theories or lenses First, I selected the constructivist learning theory because of its ability to capture the widest array of possible influences and impacts on an instructor. Because so little is known about instructors' perceptions of digital video, I did not want to be constrained by a narrow lens. The second theory, CTML, explains how people learn from video and provides the 11 design principles as concrete elements that I use to look for quality in video products. All but 2 of the design principles have a meta-analysis that reporting positive effect sizes in terms of student learning improvement when the principles are implemented. And all of the principles, including the 2 without a meta-analysis, have a strong research base demonstrating their value. So now let's get into the study design. The setting for my study was a large regional public university in the Mid-Atlantic that had over 900 full and part-time instructional faculty, which from here on out I will call instructors. This setting has been engaged in online learning since 2010. They have a publicly available listing of online courses and instructors that I could use to identify the sample population during the fall 2020 semester. Now, before COVID, I was focused on just online instructors. COVID obviously forced all instructors to teach online in some format, but I retained that focus on those original online instructors because my assumption was that those individuals would be the most likely to be knowledgeable about the CTML design principles and to apply them. My goal through this investigation was to try and identify the best or upper bounds of implementation. Here's the design that I utilized. A note about the case study method. I used the work of Miriam to guide my process because she described a case study research method which included engaging in a literature review, building a theoretical framework, crafting a research problem with research questions, and selecting a sample with purpose, which, as you have just heard me say, are all steps that I took. I did supplement Miriam's method with some of Yin's process to help with reliability and validity, which can sometimes be a weakness of some of the methods that Miriam describes. Big picture, here's the research process I went through. I used the survey data to identify the 5 instructors who best implemented the CTML design principles for interviews. I used hypothesis coding on both the interview data and the video artifact data, with the design principles serving as the codes. This allowed me to anchor the codes in the theoretical framework and create opportunities to connect all 3 data sets. This is a form of triangulation, which is a concept that both Yin and Miriam articulated as a means of strengthening the reliability and validity of the study. Because no instrument exists to measure this type of data, I developed my own survey, which had 17 questions in the 4 sections, which you see here on the screen. I used 2 related studies as reference guides. I did conduct a content validity check with 4 experts prior to use. In the second section of the survey, focused on those design principles, I asked the participants to consider their best video as they filled out the survey questions. For most of the design principles, I used a paired set of questions, which you can see here on the screen. This allowed me to create 2 separate sets of scale scores on the implementation of the principles, and I could also run a reliability check between the paired questions. So speaking of that reliability check, all of the principles, except for modality, had a statistically significant relationship, which allowed me to reject the null hypothesis that the data was not related. Based on this calculation and another I'll share soon, I had confidence that the reported data was reliable. I used a semi-structured interview guide to conduct interviews through Zoom, which lasted between 30 and 60 minutes per individual. At the bottom there was my first interview question. It's called a grand tour question, which was excellent at getting things started and collecting data. And for those of you in the audience that are in the cohorts coming up behind ours, if you're still planning your dissertations and thinking about doing interviewing, highly recommend this type of question to get started. I also collected a video from each of the 5 interviewees because they provided corroborating and augmenting evidence that was non-reactive or stable. What that means is that the videos were created outside of the presence or influence of this research and could thus support or refute the data collected from the other 2 sources. All right, results time. I had a pretty strong response rate, which you can see on the screen. The average instructor who completed the survey had previously taught 13 online course sections and was teaching 2 course sections during the semester in which I collected data. As you can see with the table on the right, the conditions at this university led to 94.6% of instructors indicating they had some level of interest to teach their first online course. 88% of the 131 courses in the survey data were using video. The average course had 23 videos in it, 9 of which were made by someone other than the instructor, and surprisingly, 14 of which were created by the instructor. Another interesting little tidbit is that 10% of the instructors were not planning to make any video during that semester. So as I said, I used the responses on those 2 sets of questions to create 2 different scale scores of CTML design principle implementation. One I called the simple scale, and the other I called the complex scale. Very creative naming, I know. For the simple scale, a response on a question that indicated the application of the principle earned 1 point, and the points were added up to create an overall score. I followed a similar process for the complex scale, but assigned a point value of 5 for the Likert response that indicated maximum application of the principle, and then decreased in point value for each scale response that moved away from that maximum application. You can see the descriptive statistics for these scales on the screen, but this data also allowed me to estimate the overall principle application. As an instructional designer, I look at that data and go, okay, that's good, but still plenty of room for improvement. I also ran a Pearson correlation calculation between the 2 scales as another measure of checking the reliability of the survey instrument. I used the simple scale score to identify the 5 instructors I would interview. I did have a tie in scores, which I broke using the complex scale score, and a question on the survey about who was willing to share a video with me. I did have one instructor who was not willing to share, and so I did not interview them. I had an instructor from earth space science, languages, health, nutrition, and nursing. And the data you see here is about their previous online course section teaching experience, their initial interest in teaching online, the number of courses they were currently teaching, and the number of videos they created for use in those courses. All right, so looking at the whole population of instructors from the survey, here are the results per design principle. The more of a bar you see to the left side of the vertical black line, the better overall reported implementation. The blue to orange is the Likert scale questions, and the green to red are the yes-no dichotomous questions. The exceptions on what you see here are segmenting and voice. More on segmenting in a minute, but voice is either all human for the blue or a mix of human and computer voice for the one person in the gray. Well, I reported on all 11 principles in my dissertation. In the interest of time, I'm only going to share a couple. If you'd like to learn more, certainly read the whole dissertation when it comes out. So first, let me start with a positive example. Temporal contiguity is when related narration and images are synchronized, so they occur at the same time in a video. This was one of 2 principles that did not use the yes-no question, but instead had a scaled question in 10% increments. And as you can see here on the screen, instructors implemented this principle robustly, as most of the data is towards the right side, which is closer to full implementation. When I reviewed the interview transcripts, a key theme that emerged is represented by this quote from Tessa, the health instructor. Now that quote, along with others, I summarized down to a theme of what you see here: show an image and talk about it, which is exactly what I just did on this slide. This principle had strong consistency among the interview data and the video artifacts from the interviewees. One principle that did not have strong consistency among the data sources was signaling. The signaling principle is applied when a video creator highlights important information in a multimedia product. So if you look here at this chart at Christine and Bertha, it's almost like they traded their Likert responses with each other. Christine said most of the time on the survey but only had about 20% of her video with signaling in it. Whereas Bertha, who said some of the time in the survey, had almost 80% application of signaling in her video. You see a similar but not quite as pronounced confusion with George and Tiana, and their responses of half the time with 10 and 5% in the video. This is an example from the data that highlights how instructors didn't necessarily know the principles that they were applying. I also had situations where the themes identified from the interviewees provided explanations for why those interviewees were better at implementing the principles than others in the study, and also helped explain why a score for a principle might have been a little lower among the sample population. The redundancy principle says, do not narrate on-screen text in a multimedia product. Yet, 55% of the sample were reading on-screen text in 30% or more of their video. Now, one of the interviewees, George, creates field videos of himself out in the real world. That type of video doesn't have any text on the screen, which makes it impossible for him to violate this principle. So the idea of this first theme here is that they cannot, George cannot violate this particular principle. Bertha has a quote that helps explain both of the next two themes related to this principle, and I'll read that to you. She said, I don't read as many words off the screen as I used to. However, sometimes if it's one of those phrases that's up there that's powerful, I'll read it because I feel like it needs to be reinforced, not just by being there visually for the students, but by them hearing it spoken out loud. So a need to signal important information may be causing some additional redundant reading. So as I said, the segmenting principle, which states that it's better to break a multimedia product into user-controlled parts. Because content can be contextual, I went with an approach of using time to measure this principle. As you can see, the average time is above the research recommended maximum of 15 minutes. However, the median is under. Now, more than a third of instructors are creating video that they deem to be their best that's over 15 minutes long. So two themes emerge from the interviewees that could help that 38% as they create future videos. One theme that emerged was that the interviewees intentionally chunked content into shorter videos. And the other theme was that they imposed a time limit on themselves and tried to stick to it. Data from the survey indicated that on average, it took an instructor 1 hour and 48 minutes to create a single video. The most popular tools used were Camtasia, Kaltura, Zoom, and PowerPoint. However, PowerPoint use is likely underrepresented as lecture style was reported on 76% of the responses. 3 of the 5 interviewees did not report on the survey that they used PowerPoint. However, during interviews, they did discuss using it. So that raises a really interesting question about how instructors perceive tools in relation to video creation that could be investigated in a future study. The qualitative interview data confirmed that creating an instructional video is a time commitment. The 5 instructors also reported time pressure to create video, which Christine summed up nicely in these quotes. Some of the tasks that went into the creation process included preparation items, such as reviewing content and building PowerPoint slides. There were also editing tasks, such as retakes and modifying closed captions. Now, George again described a very interesting exception to these preparation themes, which you can see here. He doesn't do any pre-planning. Yet because he's filming himself explaining something out in the real world, he's created a situation where he still is meeting many of the design principles. So that's a very interesting model for other instructors to consider applying. So let's get to the discussion here with a few more results thrown in. I'm going to review each of the 4 sub-research questions. So the first sub-research question, which you can see there at the top, the sample reflected the best possible outcome regarding CTML design principle incorporation because it included instructors who'd already received training to teach online, reporting on their best self-made digital instructional video. With that in mind, returning to the scale scores, the upper bounds of the instructor implementation of the principles is situated somewhere in the midst of these two numbers. If we look at the principles individually, and here I took the earlier slide and ordered it based on implementation, we can see where improvement is needed: segmenting, redundancy, signaling, and embodiment. Sub-research question number 2. Two major influences emerged in terms of the components of video production that instructors were focused on during creation. The personal impact of the creation process on the instructor certainly impacted their decision-making. For example, if an act was going to take too long, they might not do it. Second, students are a significant focus during the creative process. 4 themes emerged around the idea of the student focus of instructors, and in the interest of time, I'll just read a quote demonstrating the first theme. It's from Bertha. She said, "I try to keep in mind that for the students that might be listening to these lectures while they're at work, in the dish room, because these are a lot of nutrition students. They could have their earbuds in and their phone going, and they're listening to lectures while they're working." And so I think that's a really good example that demonstrates how these instructors were thinking about their students as they were going through that creative process. So sub-research question number 3. Among the 5 interviewees, there was clear evidence that the principles of coherence, signaling, temporal contiguity, segmenting, personalization, embodiment, and voice were applied robustly in the video artifacts. So you can see those on the left side there. They don't have any highlighting. The interviewees mostly met the redundancy principle, which is down at the bottom in the light green highlighting, as they all kept redundant reading under 20% of their total video length. George was the only one that fully implemented the principle with no redundant reading of on-screen text. Now, spatial contiguity and pre-training were inconclusive. Not enough data collected via the qualitative portion to feel confident in the conclusions. And I want you to take note of modality at the top there, highlighted in yellow. According to the survey results, it looks really good in terms of implementation. And the modality principle is when words are presented as spoken narration rather than as on-screen text. Instructors are using narration to convey information. They are doing that robustly. But it appears they're also using a significant amount of on-screen text. While the survey results appear to indicate that the principle is being applied robustly, the evidence from the video artifacts of the 5 interviewees undercuts the validity of those findings. Only George's video, again, it had no on-screen text, so he's the only one that could be considered as fully applying this principle among the interviewees. And then you'll see here that 2 of the interviewees had 100% of their video with text-based information, and another had over 80%. So given that strong mismatch between the data sources, the application of this particular principle remains unclear. Last sub-research question. The evidence here points to instructors incorporating the principles based on personal experiences and preferences, and not from knowledge of the specific CTML design principles. Throughout all of the data collection among all 3 sources, only 1 survey response mentioned the cognitive theory of multimedia learning by name. So the instructors may know to apply the concepts, but they don't appear to understand or know the underlying research about why it is effective. So some directions for future research. I have 5 here that I have highlighted. In particular, I think a replication of this study outside of pandemic conditions is definitely warranted, along with a repetition at some other locations to see how the results compare. So finally, I have 5 recommendations for instructors looking to improve their video creation. The first suggestion is to be a video star. Be in your video as narrator and on camera using natural human gestures. Then add in some signals to highlight important information. As you are creating, check your text to ensure that you have as little as possible on the screen. Account for the time by setting a time limit for yourself. And finally, identify the tools available to you, learn how to use them, and then apply the design principles as you create. You can apply these concepts with any set of tools. Now you'll notice I have 5 QR codes on the screen. I've done a short little video that explains each of these. So those QR codes go to the video, but I've also tweeted out the links to the videos, hopefully while this presentation's been going on.